you all for joining this webinar. Today, I'll be focusing on data governance in a big data world. What has become very much a theme and a learning from working with some of the largest enterprises across the world is that we need a new playbook. The traditional mechanisms for solving data governance challenges do not scale in a big data world. My name is Tim Ward. I have the pleasure of working with the CluedIn team where we help large enterprises in becoming data-driven. And when you think about that, there's the need for overall data management. And data governance very much falls under that umbrella of data management. So let's start with the obvious factors. Your company data is scattered globally across your business. And in some cases, these source systems are of such a legacy nature that they don't make it easy to become data-driven businesses and to get success with data governance strategies. Now, of course, at CluedIn, we are firm believers in that data governance is still primarily rooted in people, process, and to maybe a more modern extent, data culture as well. Now, technology has always played a role in this overall data governance piece. But more and more, as we learn from working with our large enterprise customers, technology is needed to scale the people and the processes side of data governance. Now, I think most would agree that the idea or the concept behind data governance at core is the ability to formally manage data throughout the enterprise. But I would like to add our own little dimension on top of this. How can we have data governance with confidence? How can we utilize technology to give us confidence in utilizing our data throughout the business where, let's be honest, big data has given us such low confidence in our ability to utilize the data? Now, when we think about big data, it's often that we think about these 3 V's. It rolls off the tongue very nicely. Velocity, volume, and variety. More data, more real time, in more formats. But actually what you'll find is that when you work with enterprise businesses, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. This is just the surface. What the big data movement did for data governance is it actually revealed years of technical data debt. It required us to put all of our cards on the table, to air out our dirty laundry. Essentially, if the idea is to start to put our data to use, what big data did is it realized what we needed to do to our data to get it in a state to become valuable. And most vendors, most providers of technology in the big data world have also relied on the backbone and the infrastructure of cloud. So it's forced us as enterprise companies to navigate the complex world of cloud. But actually, I think most importantly what it did is it showed us the shortcomings and it exposed us to the limitations of managing in a small data world. So the data governance techniques, the traditional techniques we utilize today, became very apparent very quickly that they did not scale to a big data world. So then what is the main problem set we're trying to address here? Well, can we scale data governance in a big data world, but to a greater extent in a big enterprise world with complex, distributed, global businesses? To a lesser extent, let's highlight 2 main questions. How can we utilize cross-company data as a key value-adding asset with that extra dimension on top of doing this with confidence? And how do we scale to govern the complexity of what could be distributed and localized business rules on our data. Whether that's retention policies, data policies, business rules, compliance rules, regulatory rules. How do we scale the complexity across a global business to give us the power of global data governance, but with the complexity of managing it at a local level? So one of the first things that we should always do is to check who are those that have already solved this. That lets us tick that box of making sure this can actually be solved in the modern day. I'd like to talk about two businesses. The first is ISS. ISS is a leading facility services management business globally. With over 500,000 employees, they have distributed businesses all across the globe. And coming with this is the complexity of localized regulation, localized business rules, but with the requirement to get a full global view of the data that sits across their business. The other is Nordea. Nordea is one of the leading banks in Europe. And coming with the financial services business is that added complexity of regulations and legislations and common audits that happen throughout the year on a regular basis. So how did they achieve data governance from a global perspective? Without sounding too contrarian, it's really about forgetting the traditional mechanisms that we use for data governance today. We've established that they do not scale to meet the demands of modern businesses. Now, instead of just technology itself, there is the need for a new level of technology abstraction. And let me give you an example. If you're building an application inside your enterprise, maybe it's an application to host employee data, you'll often require maybe a database to persist that data. Now, when you're choosing which database you would like to utilize, you no longer have to choose different querying engines and indexing engines and storage engine and caching engines. You purchase a database because they have packaged that technology into a level of abstraction that solves the challenge of persisting and querying data. And the same analogy can be assigned to how we solve complex data governance issues. Now, how do we solve those complex issues in other industries? Well, it's often that we break down a large, complex issue into smaller, discrete, and isolated components. Because we've already alluded to the fact that this challenge today, from a top-down perspective, does not scale. It's just not possible with the current approaches. And so I'd like to introduce two ideas, concepts. The first is this concept of a data foundation, this new level of technology abstraction that allows us to isolate a lot of the complexity that exists with any project that we work on that involves data. The other is an architecture that allows us to scale globally, regionally, and even locally. This governance architecture is referred to as the data hub architecture. So let's first touch on the data foundation. The data foundation is the concept that whenever we have any project that is fueled by data, it turns out we jump through the same types of pillars of data management. There's always an integration component. There's always a data preparation piece. There's always a governance and enrichment piece. There's a compliance and privacy component. And then, of course, what good would all of this be without this data being easily discoverable throughout the business? So you can think of the data foundation as an ecosystem where your data is already integrated, already cleaned, the governance has already been applied, such as access control, permissions, data ownership and responsibility. The enrichment has already been applied, and the data is cataloged in a way that makes it very discoverable to be able to fuel different use cases throughout the business. And these common use cases that our customers utilize CluedIn for are things like KYC, knowing your customer. It might be for fueling insights and business intelligence. It might be for sending data that's ready to use to the data science team so they can work on innovation projects. Now, one of the ways that we need to solve this is that if we take a look at the data landscape today, if we look at every single component that is necessary to make a company data-driven, it's quite overwhelming. And when we ask the business, what do they want? I can guarantee you one thing. What the business wants is quick access to ready-to-use data. They are not as involved or aware or even care about the underlying pieces or components. They don't care about governance. They don't care about lineage. They don't care about cataloging and retention and integration and cleaning. They want quick access to ready-to-use data. And this is the foundation. This is the concept of a data foundation. Can I give my business ready-to-use data to fuel value-adding use cases? So then why is this necessary? Why do we have to take this approach? Well, first of all, and of course we also see leading market analyst firms like Gartner reinforcing this, there is a move in our data management industry towards more consolidated applications. Applications or platforms that are taking care of the different pillars of data management, such as data integration or data governance. And one thing you'll find through this consolidation and working with large enterprises is that data governance can very much benefit from being aware of the other pillars of data management. It's often that we see the way that these projects work is that we have a data governance team and they have their own data governance tools. We might have a data quality team with their own data quality tools, and then a separate data integration team with their own tools. The convergence of these pillars into a data foundation is showing through customers that it is important that data governance is aware of those other pillars. Because the convergence of these pillars doesn't only greatly simplify data governance, they can make governance scale. So now that we've got this concept of the data foundation in place, how do we enable technology like this to work and scale in a globally distributed business with complex data governance rules? And for this, we really need to look at architecture. When it comes to architecture in the data management space, we often go back and forth between centralized applications or decentralized applications. And what becomes very apparent when you start to work in these complex landscapes is that there is the need for a hybrid. There is the need for a combination of centralized and decentralized architecture. And actually, this is something that Gartner refers to as the data hub architecture. The concept behind data hubs, the fantastic thing about it is that it actually correlates well to how businesses themselves operate, where we usually have global headquarters, regional offices with maybe a regional headquarter, and then we have localized entities. So what we're talking about here is we have a network of hubs that are related to each other in many different ways. So we often refer to this communication between the hubs as the mesh. Others are referring to as the hub orchestrator. Now, the beauty of this architecture is that it allows us to manage the complexity of localized business rules, retention policies, regulation, privacy, and more. But we ask the mesh or the hub orchestrator to manage the complexity of how these rules will interoperate between hubs. So how does this change things? How does the traditional approach of data governance and architecture change with the data hub model? Well, one of the realizations that came from the big data, big data movement was that we no longer live in a black and white kind of landscape in data. Data governance in a big data world really comes down to a healthy balance of risk and confidence. And a lot of this came from the fact that we're working with a lot more unstructured or semi-structured data. It makes it harder to fit it into a perfect model. Now, also coming from this was the business demand for self-service data. And whether this is self-service data science or self-service business intelligence, it's the concept that essentially would be typically a governance nightmare. How can we make free-flowing data available to the forefront of business? One of the great things that has come from many movements in the data space recently, such as big data, GDPR, and CCPA, and on top of this, the self-service movement, is that it was really about putting all our cards on the table. It was a time for us as enterprise businesses to talk about airing out our dirty laundry with our data, to reveal our technical data debt. So it showed to the business that we needed to address things like data governance globally, data quality globally. So then why does this approach of a data foundation combined in a data hub architecture work? Well, first of all, let's go back to some principles. Most companies are still trying to solve a lot of their data challenges with the same type of database. That's the relational database. Now, I'm a big fan of the relational database. It solves many challenges in the data landscape. But when we actually think about how our data is naturally connected, it's not a relational model. It's much more of a network, a graph. Think of it like your data is connected like your LinkedIn network. There's relationships that are going in between all the different objects that exist within your enterprise. And this is also the way that the hubs and data hub architecture is naturally composed. We have a network of hubs that interoperate with each other using the hub orchestration framework. Now, as from the hub model itself, what are the challenges that it addresses and solves? You can imagine that there probably isn't an easy way from a top-down perspective to solve data governance. Just imagine a global headquarters handing down all the rules and the policies for localized representations of their business. This is where the challenge starts. Now, the hub model actually allows companies to manage their own localized vocabularies, models, policies, retention, business rules, even validation down at a local level. It's the responsibility of the mesh or the hub orchestrator that figures out how these different rules will play from one hub to another. The mesh knows and understands how to even transform data between other hubs to comply to localized or potentially global rules. It is worth adding that this really helps with data lineage as well. Being able to trace where data has moved from hub to hub, even within its own hub. Where did the data come from? Where is it being shared? How is it being utilized in assets across the business? Now, all of this good quality, integrated, governed, compliant data would still not be that valuable if it wasn't discoverable. And that's where the data catalog comes in. Your ability to manage terminology, glossaries, dictionaries, and lexicons at a localized level, but being able to interoperate with catalogs from other hubs. You can probably imagine that terminology changes locally. We might refer to a customer in a certain way in one region, but from a global level, we might have a completely different way to describe that type of domain object within our business data. Now, of course, this wouldn't be anything without proper access control, and the Data Hub architecture supports that. The ability to roll out access control permissions by simply plugging into an LDAP provider of choice, such as Active Directory. What all of this foundation and hub architecture came to is the realization of an idea of distributed master data management, where records could be, or golden records could be, orchestrated in either one hub or over multiple hubs. But more importantly, this master data, these golden records, can be proliferated out to the hubs where the work actually needs to be applied. So this concept of distributed MDM is absolutely game-changing for the master data management industry. But where is the human factor in this? We've let technology take over quite a lot, but we have to remember that data governance is still rooted in people and process, and as I mentioned, to some degree, culture. So what role do data stewards play in this new world of data governance with big data? It goes without saying that the role of a data steward has changed. It has evolved. What used to be dedicated staff and product owners for specific data sets has now been evolved to much more involving the domain experts that are closest to the data that needs to be addressed. And more than ever, we are seeing a shift, and there is even a particular role that is being evolved out of this, the data citizen. More and more, we are seeing the business involved in the process of data quality management and data responsibility. And the hub architecture completely allows us to pinpoint, even across hubs, whether that's local, regional, or global, who are the best people, whether it's data stewards or data citizens, to address data quality issues, policies, rules, retention, etc. And one of the ways that data stewarding is completely evolving and changing is by utilizing machine learning. Now, some analyst firms are referring to this as augmented data governance. Others are referring to things like active metadata to let the data do the work instead of taking this manual approach to governing data. And CluedIn very much embraces this much more modern technique to being able to scale data stewardness in a big data world. So the way to think about it is like bringing up a child. Imagine you have a child that you have 2 or 3 years old, and you play this kind of game with them where you put all of their teddy bears out on the floor, and then you go to the kitchen and bring out maybe some more dangerous items like knives from the kitchen, maybe a torch or a flame. And you spend your time in reinforcing to that child that teddy bears are good and knives are bad. You should not touch knives, teddy bears are okay. Now, if I was to spend my time in reinforcing that on a daily basis, over time, if I was to bring in, for example, a bigger knife, or maybe a completely different object completely, and maybe something like a chainsaw, if I was then to show that child the chainsaw, what we're hoping is that we have reinforced or annotated or labeled enough data with that child for them to be able to start making the decisions by themselves. Now, I alluded to before that we no longer live in a black and a white world with data. It's not a 0 or a 1 or a binary type of world. And because of this, we need to be able to have levels of confidence that we can work with when we're talking about automated decisions. And just like we have parents for the child, we have the same type of mechanism that we can apply from a governance perspective. We can always have stewards there that are there to be able to teach the system more and more and capture the exceptions when they happen. So we can apply this same type of analogy to the way that we solve data quality issues and data governance issues. Think about the way that we do this now. We upfront come up with, or try to come up with, all the business rules we can possibly think about to dictate policies in our data. And the bottom line is, a majority of companies have a history of data, an audit log of data that they have cleaned over time. Machine learning was designed to solve this challenge, to utilize historical data to dictate the business rules instead of us coming up front with them. This is the future of data stewards in the data governance space. And what's evolved out of this is that more and more we're seeing data stewards don't have to be technical. They are the domain experts, also sometimes referred to now as data citizens. But utilizing the data hub architecture, the framework, we can utilize that hub network to pinpoint who are the one data steward or many data stewards that are close to the context of the data that can help apply cleaning, quality control, governance rules, etc. So then, what did we learn from working with these large enterprises that needs to be addressed in our industry? Now, the first I'd like to touch on gets a little bit technical. So imagine we have a localized system that manages our customers, and we have a rule that we need to impose, which is if a customer lasts in our CRM longer than 3 years, we need to archive it off to a third-party system. That's a business rule we set up in the source system. Now, to instruct the other hubs in the network that that's a rule, we need some way to be able to tell them. We need some way for the hub orchestrator to be aware of that rule. And so currently we would then say, okay, can you also map that rule into platforms like CluedIn? That will allow all the other networks to be aware of what that business rule is. Now, what this means now is that I've got 2 places where I have the same business logic. And every time I need to change that, I now need to be aware of changing that or updating that in these 2 places. So what this meant was we saw the requirement and the need for centralized business rule orchestration, where instead of hard coding or statically placing in that business logic into the source, or a platform like CluedIn, we could call off to a third party, an orchestrator, a sovereign system that manages the complexity of the rules, and we can implement those rules differently in the different systems. When we need to update those rules, we can then of course go to the centralized business rule orchestration server to change and make those changes. The other thing that came up is that we are not even giving enterprises the chance to have consistent data across their business. Dependent upon the tool stack that we're utilizing in our business, what you'll often find is that one CRM will validate data on data entry very different to another CRM. So what this means is that those who are entering the data, they don't even have the chance to enter it in a consistent, normalized manner. So what this dictated is there was the need for a centralized validation engine, where these systems, instead of statically placing in the rules on what's valid data for forms versus not valid data, they could call off to a centralized validation engine to dynamically figure out what is the global rules or regional or localized. There wasn't the need to conform to one typical type of validation. However, you might find from a regional perspective, we do actually want to comply to a certain type of phone number or a certain way to express an email address or maybe a home address or physical address. So that's some of the work that came out of working with these large enterprises, is identifying these real world needs for products like data foundations and CluedIn. So what were the main complexities? Well, apart from the fact that Even from a conceptual level, it's very hard to manage all the localized business rules and have them operate across different regions. Coming with this was also the complexity around access control. How do you have fine-grained access control that supports rules across a distributed and complex type of business? Of course, lineage and global distribution of where the data was hosted, or the sovereignty, was also complex. And of course, each region or country might have their own interpretations or privacy acts. And of course, the global data retention, this became difficult because it required that we had to talk back to systems to potentially move data, archive data, or even delete data. So you can imagine that there was the need for this centralized kind of orchestrator to figure out if we need to remove a particular customer, how would that have to play against all the localized hubs and their source systems as well? So then what now? We can confidently say that these businesses and our customers that have taken this approach are now data-driven businesses, where they can start to utilize what was the siloed data that sits across their business in a much more confident and governed manner. This is what leads to being able to establish a company data culture where we can utilize data in a trustworthy manner to fuel use cases throughout the business. So thank you very much for spending your time with me on this webinar, and we would love to hear more about what your feedback is on the Data Hub architecture with the foundation, and we'd very much like to help you with some of your data challenges. Thank you.